Our next presenter is Stephanie Antiquino, Memorabilia Archivist for Planet Hollywood. She'll be presenting on the topic of documentation from both the museum and library point of view.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. So we're going to start out with documentation from the museum point of view and then move into the library and archives point of view. I want to state up front that I am museum trained, not library or archive trained. So when we get to the end of the presentation during the Q&A, if anybody that is a little bit more familiar with library and archives points of views of the documentation, please feel free to add anything that you feel I missed. So documentation is extremely important, as we just saw with the loan paperwork and condition reports and things like that. Documentation just isn't paperwork. It can be the digital images, it can be audio recordings. For example, with the digital images, if you're doing a condition report, you might take photographs if there's something that's specifically noteworthy. So you have those as part of your record. It's letters back and forth. Those loan requests that they were referring to in the previous presentation, those would be part of the documentation that you would keep. Any receipts, photographs, anything related to any of the acquisitions or actions that are going on would be part of that documentation that you would want to keep. So it's extremely important to have a documentation system so that you know what an item is, where it came from, what has happened to it over time, and that proof of ownership. I'm sure that we've all experienced someone coming in saying, "Hey, Aunt Sally donated my great grandmother's quilt 40 years ago. Where is it? I want to see it." So that's why documentation is extremely important. We want to make sure that we can go back and know that yes, Jane Doe did donate Aunt Sally's quilt, and we can find out paper trail of where it is now, hopefully. When we were talking about do we keep the loan paperwork, this is something, especially with condition reporting, it shows what happens to an object over time. So you can understand that 30 years ago it came in and it was in pristine condition. 25 years ago it was on exhibit and it fell and it cracked. Uh, you know, 15 years ago we had money to conserve it and things like that. So that's, in my opinion, that's why I feel that it's extremely important to keep that trail of documentation. It's the history of an item and how it got to be in the condition that it is currently. Plus, you want to be able to show proof of ownership. Jane Doe may come in and say, "Hey, so and so lent you Aunt Sally's quilt." Well, no, I have proof of ownership. I have a deed of gift stating right here that it was actually given to us. Documentation, so it can be in paper form or it can also be your collections management system, whatever it is that you're using to keep track of all of your records in your CMS. And it allows you to retrieve the information no matter what form it is. So if you are referring to the paper files, if you have your accession files, your loan files, things like that, that they would be stored in a retrievable manner that is chronological or whatever system that you have, if you have it alphabetical, just something that you know how to retrieve the information if you do need that. You can see here this. I like this little cartoon because all the remainders are just off to the side. So yeah, we didn't know what to do with it, so we just put it there. And I know that we probably all have that little corner in our museum, but we're trying to get rid of that. So one of the things that we want to do in order to have good documentation to avoid jargon and slang, this is probably more in with science and technology museums. So there might be some specific name for some type of machinery or something like that that the layperson coming in might not know what that is, but the scientist who accepted it into the collection 50 years ago may, obviously knew what it was. So if you do have something like that, use appropriate terminology, but use a glossary if necessary. Use photographs and drawings and other permanent images. This is especially important, as we mentioned, for condition reporting and things like that. But it's also important in your collections management system. You want to have photographs uh, so that not only you have a good description of what you have, but you can actually see it as well. And it should be permanent. You should be trying to use acid-free paper for all of your documentation. light, fast, non-acidic ink. We want to try and print rather than use cursive because, as we all know, we've probably looked at books from 150 years ago and we kind of think we know what it says, but we're not really sure. You also want to make sure not to use pencil because pencil can be erased. I know that sounds awkward saying because we always want to use pencil around our objects, but hopefully we're not really filling out this paperwork necessarily right beside the objects, so go ahead and use a pen. And again, using the archival materials. Prior to coming to Planet Hollywood, I was at the Orange County Regional History Center for 7 years, and all of our loan and accession files are in archival acid-free file folders. You also want to make sure that you are as comprehensive as possible. I don't know how many times I've seen paperwork that says, 27 photographs. Okay, well, that's really great, but 27 photographs of what? So you want to try and not leave a mess for the next person coming in. You don't have to necessarily be super descriptive, but 5 black and white photographs of Orange Avenue, 7 photographs of Lake Eola, things like that, so that the next person coming in understands it, or even you in 5 years when you're looking back at your paperwork, what did I mean by that? So you don't want that to happen. Sometimes a donor will want you to be specific and will want a really comprehensive list of everything itemized, but that's something that you should discuss with them at the time of acquisition. Having a good documentation policy ensures that the museum is going to manage the collections properly, and these are, again, of written and electronic collections. It makes sure that you know what types of what types of records you're going to keep, what information they should contain, and who's responsible for keeping them. And you also want to make sure that the records are updated regularly and that they're maintained on archival media if possible. That's really relating to the electronic records and duplicate records. So as we mentioned in the previous session, the majority of institutions are keeping scanned copies, the electronic copies, as well as the hard paper copies. And you want to make sure that they are kept in separate locations, because if something happens to your site and all of your paper records and all of your electronic records are kept together, there's very high likelihood that everything is going to be damaged. Whereas if you have something stored offsite, or if your electronic records are stored in the cloud and your paper records are stored at your museum, then you have a better chance that if something happens to one site, it's hopefully not going to happen to both sites, unless we're really in trouble. There are documentation standards out there. The American Alliance of Museums has Standard 4, which is related to collection stewardship, and you can see that it does talk about the management and care and documentation. This publication is actually available for free on the American Alliance of Museums website, so you can download it as a PDF. And this is a really great document because it not only talks about collection stewardship, but it talks about governance and everything like that as well. So this is just more of what the AAM standard says regarding requirement of a system of documentation, records management, and inventory for permanent and temporary acquisitions. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American Association for State and Local History. They have the Standards and Excellence Program for History Organizations, STEPS project, which is a series of self-paced actions that you can go through in order to bring your institution up to currently accepted standards. And their stewardship of collection standards too, again, specifically lists that institution legally, ethically, and effectively manages, documents, and cares for and uses the collections. So both AAM and SLH have those documentation standards as a part of their overall museum standards, as do a lot of museum organizations throughout the world. So one document that you might want to have, and I would actually highly suggest it, is a temporary custody receipt. And you can see the types of information that should be on this particular document. This is particularly helpful for those doorstep drop-offs, which I'm sure we've all had. It's Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and the only people that are on staff that day are maybe a couple of docents and the person working in a museum store. So when I was at the History Center, things may have changed now, but we had temporary custody receipts down at the front desk for this very instance. So if somebody did come in and drop something off and there was nobody on the collection staff there to accept the items or to refused them, they filled out this form, and the form specifically stated that if the item, here's actually the History Center's form, that they may or may not keep the items. And you can see that we had sections as to say, okay, if you don't want it back, go ahead and get rid of it. A lot of collections management systems, this is an image from PastPerfect museum software. I know that there are several different types of CMS programs that are out there, but PastPerfect has a section for temporary custody. And what I liked about this is that you can actually turn these into an accession if you do decide to keep them, or you can turn it into a loan. But this way you have your paper trail and you have your electronic copy as well. So a deed of gift, this is what's transferring ownership from an individual or an organization over to your organization. It's stating that the person owns the property, confirming their belief that they own the object and that they have the ability to pass the title. I know this is extremely important in art institutions. It's important for everyone, but especially a lot of arts organizations. Again, just some of the information that you want to have on there, making sure that the date is there. You want to make sure you have the contact information so you can get in touch with this person. You also want to make sure that this information, this paperwork is going to be kept in your permanent file. And then here's the Museum of Danish America, their deed of gift. And you can see they have terms and conditions for artifact donations on the reverse side of the document. And again, just an image from PastPerfect showing what an accession record looks like and all of the items that came along with it. Incoming loans, I know we dealt a lot with this with the last one, so I won't go over this too much. But one thing that I will mention is that at the History Center, we implemented as part of the terms and conditions for the loan. If any of you during the last module did the mid-module webinar on abandoned property, you learned about Florida Statute 265.565. And so as part of the conditions for an incoming loan, we did just put on there that all loans are, that statute does apply to all loans. And I did actually have to contact some people and say, hey, you agreed to this and your loan has been up for a really long time. Do you want your stuff or I'm going to trash it? And they got their stuff. So it actually worked. And again, just an example of from PastPerfect. I apologize, I'm just using PastPerfect. I know there's other CMSs out there, but showing that you want to have the paper trail, but you also want to make sure that you have everything cataloged in your CMS for easier retrieval as well. Outgoing loans, again, you're going to have a tracking number, the borrower's name, the date of the loan, purpose, description and condition and value, and whoever is the museum representative who's responsible for signing your documents will be signing all of these documents. And again, that'll be part of your collections management policy as to who's responsible for all of that information. Just an example of an outgoing loan agreement, outgoing loan screen. And then deaccessioning, you want to make sure that when you're filling out your deaccessioning, it's the name of the date of recommendation, who's doing the recommending, object ID, description, all of the information contained here. And the Indianapolis Museum of Art does a really great job of showcasing their deaccession pieces. It actually shows what it was, when it was, why, and the transfer notes as to what the final disposition was for it. So it's kind of inspiring. And then here's some just samples of deaccession paperwork. And again, all of this should be part of your collections management policy. So documentation from the library and archives point of view, again, at the end, if any of those that are in the library and archives have anything to add, please feel free. It's all very, very similar. A library donation form would have the date, the donor's contact information, total number of books, CDs, etc. are donated, and whether or not the donor would like acknowledgement from the library. And then here's just a couple of samples. You can see that they're a memorial book donation, so you can say who you would like the book to be donated in memoriam of Great Aunt Sally or whoever. So what I'm really jealous about coming from the museum world is that libraries and archives get to weed, whereas we have to deaccession. So, but it's still very important to make sure that you keep your documentation for the weeding. You want to make sure that you have all of the title and call number, the criteria for weeding, who authorized it. Obviously, make sure you remove it from your catalog so that John Doe doesn't come in next week and request that book. Oh no, we don't have it anymore. Um, and then remove all book plates, etc. Because I know that a lot of libraries, once they remove their books from the collections, they might sell them in their store or at their book sale as a fundraiser. And again, just some examples of weeding procedures: a disposal slip that can be filled out and placed with the book as the process is going on. So the other good thing is that we're all different, but we're all the same. So deeds of gift for archives, again, it's the legal instrument that's acting as the donation of material to the repository. It's transferring that legal ownership. And with everything, these forms should all be reviewed approximately every 5 years by your organization's legal counsel. The same information basically that went on the deed of gift for a museum should be on a deed of gift for archives. Another thing that's really important for archives is any restrictions on use. Some donors may not want the collection to be released to the public for 10 years or whatever. So any restrictions, make sure that that is on the deed of gift because that's extremely important to have. A deposit agreement is something that's a little bit different for archives. There might be a state entity that is transferring their collection. They might be transferring, 50 years worth of documents to a specific archival repository. They're not actually going to be transferring the ownership, but they are transferring the possession of it. And so the deposit agreement, you want to make sure it's a procedure for the withdrawal and for the return of the materials. You want to describe any cost to the depositor if they are the ones that are responsible for all the housing for the materials and things like that. And then this is just an example of a government records deposit agreement. Accessioning, it's the same as for museums. It's formally accepting, recording the documents. Make sure you have an accession register, accession forms. The information that should be contained in the accession forms, same with museums. Again, any restrictions and copyright. So archives may go through a reappraisal where this is their deaccessioning process where they may split collections to make them whole. They may have to comply with a new law that came out where they have to remove something or make something no longer available. Or there may be a change in the repository's mission. Again, there should be a reappraisal form, and this is something that should be kept with the collection. And you want to make sure that you have the name of the collection, any retention schedules, any correspondence or collections, any correspondence on the file that were reviewed, any agreements that go with it, acquisition dates, and so forth. And make sure you have the physical condition and history, who owns the collection, and what your final decision is. Are you deaccessioning it? Are you transferring it to someone? Are you returning it? Are you destroying it? And New York State Archives reappraisal form, just as a sample. And that's it. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Thank you again, Stephanie. If the folks over in South Florida want to check in to see if they have any questions concerning documentation.
We have a question, Robin, just 1 minute. Okay, our question is if you have just maybe a verbal agreement between a donor and a museum or an archives, so they've already given you the object, but they haven't signed any sort of donor form or legal agreement, what is the course of action that the museum or institution needs to take in order to handle that situation?
So if they're not at the point where they're interested in signing any of the paperwork yet, you always want to make sure that you have everything in writing, because even if you have an item, you are in possession of it. So we know possession is 9/10 of the law, so they say. But if you have possession of the item, then the intent most likely was there for them to give it to you. And if you always are communicating, so this is just an example of something that may have come across before. You have a thank you letter that said, thank you for giving us this, even if you don't have anything that's signed. So if you're in the process of discussing whether or not this is going to happen, I would make sure that you have communication, draft a letter and send that out to the individual saying, thank you for your discussion last Tuesday where we, referencing the donation of your painting from Great Aunt Sally that you are interested in giving to us. And just make sure that there is that communication back and forth until you actually get to the process of completing deeds of gift. And if anybody has any other suggestions, I would be willing to hear those as well.
Well, I think that's one of those times when even like a temporary custodial form, because that's going to be only an internal form, but at least it's going to give you that paper trail, which is the thing we like, right? Is we like seeing a piece of paper like this came into our facilities. We talked to this person. It's at least the beginning of something. And also, we live in the great day of email, which is lovely because pretty much everyone emails. So for me, it's even like tracking that email correspondence, which nicely will date stamp and timestamp things, and you're really savvy, you get the red receipts in there, and you know what I mean, you do all that kind of stuff, you can start having a paper trail, which will do it. Now, I would say that for me personally, again, this is Robin yammering away, if they would give me something and they're like, oh, I want to sign it, I just want you to hold on to it, I would say I'd probably, if it's not taking up too much space, I could probably do that for about 6 months to a year. Like, I'd probably be like, all right, especially if it was something like, you're like, yes, this would be great for the collection. After you get to that point, then it's like, you got to come get it. You know what I mean? If this is not going to belong with us, you're going to get into that long-term loan world, which none of us likes, right? Like, no one likes that concept of a long-term loan. So that's something to think about as well.
And again, with the documentation, if you do accept it on a temporary basis for that 6 months, send a letter saying, thank you for allowing us to keep this for 6 months while you determine whether or not you would like to give it to us. We understand at the end of the 6 months, we will reevaluate the agreement or something along those lines. But paperwork, because you always want to cover your butt.
Technical terms. Does anyone else in South Florida have any other questions?
I think we're good. Thanks, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and check in with the folks at the Cummer Museum in Jacksonville if you guys have any questions.
No questions here.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and point out that, we talked a little bit about record retention and how long do we keep these documents around. We spoke about it a little bit with the loan stuff. I think we're one of the few jobs out there, and especially the museum world, we're like, no, we still need paper copies, right? Like, it's kind of like when you ever bought a house, like the title companies, and you sign like the crazy amount of paper, and they always apologize to me, and I'm always like, no, I've seen worse. You know what I mean? Like, we like our paper documents. I like the fact that everyone's emphasizing keeping them in multiple formats. I think that's incredibly important. I think a lot of us who are of Gen X age group have lived through the terrors of watching digital versions change and different, like all these different weird file types. Everyone remember WordPerfect file types? Like trying to translate them into a doc, and God knows what we're going to have in 10 years. You know what I mean? What's going to be the accepted paper style. So I think it's important that, we keep these digital files, and then, that's great. It's nice to have a paper file. It's nice to have it in separate locations. In case something happens at one of your locations, you still have a paper file. I'm all for having the digital files because then, if your building blows up, there's a digital file somewhere floating around out there. But then you got to deal with, file transfer types, right? So it's not, I'd like to sit there and think when it comes to documentation, it's just print out a piece of paper, have a file, and you're done. But it's not really. It's just like, that's like your little baby step into documentation. So it's just things to keep in mind, and knowing that, in today's digital world, I personally think digital records are probably safe for like maybe only 2 or 3 years before you have to just kind of look and be like, is this still the file type that's acceptable? Because like I just said, we did WordPerfect, right? And then we have Word Doc, and now it's PDF. You see PDFs becoming pretty standard in the world. I like PDFs personally. But, there's that kind of issue. So it's just something to think about. I think someone up in North Florida has a question.
Hey, Robin, it's Kristen. I have a question about what other institutions do about keeping or not keeping files on acquisitions that were declined. Because typically we'll have, either correspondence or maybe the object was actually brought in. So we'll have receipts and that sort of thing. But if they were declined and then returned to the owner, is it necessary to keep them, these files?
I personally keep them. I kept them at the History Center, and I also keep them at Planet Hollywood. We have individuals who will say, hey, I have this, do you want it? And if we decide not to go ahead and proceed with that acquisition, I do keep that because I think it's extremely important. That way, even 10 years down the road, if somebody comes along again and says, hey, I have this, we can go back and say, oh, no, we've already, refused that for whatever reason. It's also nice to just have that institutional history of these are the types of things that we are offered and these are the reasons that we declined them.
Yeah, this is Robin. I think that's a really good point. Is that I know, I worked somewhere for 7 years. That was great. We had a couple dealers who came to us a few times after that 7 years during that time trying to offer us things. We said no, but then when I left, theoretically the new staff would not know about it. Unless you had someone there who was seasoned. So I think having that stuff around for what's the bank retention? 7 years? 7. That's the only thing I fall back to sometimes with certain financial records. I'm like 7. But when it comes to us, I look at it as let's just keep it till I'm made to throw it out. You know what I mean? Like until someone says we need the space or there's a good reason to do it. I'd say just try to keep it around as much as you want, and as long as space allows. Would be my thought. Maybe if someone has a comment here in Lake Wales.
I just also wanted to add that not only from avoiding accepting something that has already been rejected at a previous time, it's also been helpful as far as sometimes donors get confused, and I've definitely gotten the call of I have donated this and this thing and this year, and why don't you guys have it? And having a record of, oh yes, you did contact us in that year. But we did not accept your loan. Are you sure you didn't then go to another museum and try there? And they're like, this isn't the Winter Park History Center? And I'm like, no, this is the Orange County Regional History Center. And they're like, oh, sorry. So there's several reasons why it's helpful to keep those things that you didn't accept.
That's a really good case study, actually, because that has happened. I think all of us have had I gave this thing to you, where is it conversation, which is always fun, talking that topic. But especially in that kind of a case when you physically don't have it and you can go back and be like, you tried, but it did not work. So it went over here. That's incredibly important. We have one other comment here in Lake Wales. That was a good point. And also, we've all dealt with if relatives try to come after you and say, well, grandma said she donated her wedding dress to your institution. Right, and you can be like, she did not. And you can go back and prove the fact that grandma did not donate her wedding dress. Sure, we have one more question. Give us 1 second.
What kind of documentation should you have in place when you're transferring objects from one sister museum to the other? So, for instance, we have 2 museums under the same parent organization, and recently I received about 100 objects that were just dropped off from one collections manager to my building, directed from our director to give them to the Funk Center. So what kind of documentation? I have the original records, but what do I need to put in place?
Do you use 2 totally separate documentation?
Mm-hmm.
So I would have some type of, and this could be part of your collections management policy, a transfer agreement between the 2 organizations,
mm-hmm.
and then you would then use your paperwork to accept it into your own organization.
So kind of do on that transfer agreement, have all of the gifts, it's like 10 years of stuff on that one agreement, not for each individual gift, right?
Well, no, I would do each individual gift because they're essentially coming from a different source.
Mm-hmm.
So I would do one for each. Sorry to make it work.
Yeah. And then when it comes to numbering those objects within the collection, would they be numbered for the year that I got them?
I would number them for the year that you're receiving them, and then if you have a field for you have old numbers, then I would use that because that old number does not pertain to your organization. It pertains to the other organization. So you would want to actually do the year that you're receiving it.
Mm-hmm. And the transfer agreement would essentially act as our deed of gift for the new institution that they're at. And would my director sign off on all of those transfer agreements?
Whoever is responsible for signing off on your, if it's you, then
so I could create.
You can create them myself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We are known for killing our trees in our organization. I think that's a really good question because a lot of us have that, right? Like the chains museums under one governing authority. And I like the question of what you'd number it, right? Like, what is that? But yeah, you're right. Like, you number it when it came into your organization. So if it was given to you in 2017, I would, using our normal little trinomial system, I'd be like, well, that's a 2017 accession for us. Track the other number because you never know, you know what I mean, what's going to happen. But I think that's a really good question. I think we've all experienced that. Oh, we have another question. To me, yeah, the question is, what do you do with the institution who gave it up? What do they do? To me, they de-accession it because they're no longer the owners, the responsible parties for that object. So you're essentially de-accessioning the object and transferring it to a like institution. You know what I mean? Like that's basically what you're doing.
And I would make sure you have all of that information in your provenance so that you can keep track of all of that history.
Yeah. Your file folder is just getting bigger and bigger. Like, my goodness.
I have one last thing that I'd like to add. There is a book out there that was created by the Texas Association of Museums, TAM. It's the Museum Forms book, and it's Texas institutions, but we're all the same. So there are lots of examples of different types of forms in there. There's deeds of gift, de-accessions, things like that. I've used that book heavily because why recreate the wheel when you don't have to? And also, you can look and see examples of institutions that might more closely resemble yours. So you can pick and choose what you think is going to be best to include in that. Also, if any of you are institutional members of AAM, they do have a museum form swap. The Registrar's Committee website, rcaam.org, they have a list of a few types of forms that are on there. And if you're communicate with all of us that are working in this webinar or in the workshop series because we're willing to share our documents. And if you're on any listservs or anything like that, that's the type of information that organizations love to share with each other because we like to help each other out because we've all been there.
Yeah, that Texas book it's a little dated now, but it's still really useful. Like you look through it and you're like, yeah, there's some forms in here I want to use. We have forms on our website too that other institutions who've gone through previous incarnations of this program, we've taken copies of their forms and loaded them on our website. If you want to donate a form, please send me your form. We can wipe it out so it looks more generic if you want to. We never release private information, but we can give people samples. Also at SCMC, the Southeastern Museum Conference, Sarah, who's in the Southeastern Registrars Association, I'm the Florida rep. Stephanie was the Florida rep back in the day. They also usually have a form swap session sometime in there. So they're good folks to do. Even Sarah itself, like I said, we're a great community where most people are kind of like, you want a form? Here's a form. And you get like a bazillion little samples, which is great. You know what I mean? Because everyone, like Stephanie said, there's no point in reinventing the wheel on these things. A basic deed of gift is a basic deed of gift. You know what I mean? You still want to vet it. You still want to make sure it works for your institution. You still want to make sure it deals with issues that you might have dealt with, but there's samples. Trust me.
And Sarah also updated, I believe it was 2 years ago, their condition report book, which has sample condition reports and the information that should be contained in those condition reports, and it's outlined by photographs, there's documents, metal items, textiles, and things like that.
I'm going to look around and see if there's any more questions here in Lake Wales. It doesn't look like it. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate it.